He thought the dog would choose his daughter. Every dog chose the person who smiled first, and Laurel always smiled first. But the old shepherd Cross pressed his gray muzzle against Cormac Delaney's knee and did not move. Cormac stood very still in the middle of the Kelowna Animal Rescue Center, his hands at his sides, his jaw set in the way it had been set for most of the past 2 years. He had come only because Laurel had asked 3 times, and he had run out of reasons to say no that did not sound like what they actually were. He was not here for a dog. He was here so his daughter would stop looking at him the way she had been looking at him since the funeral. The dog's name, according to the laminated card on the kennel gate, was Poe. He was somewhere between 7 and 9 years old, the intake sheet said, which was shelter language, for we found him alone and could only guess. He had a broad, dark head, a coat gone silver around the muzzle and chest, and one ear that stood properly while the other folded at the tip as though it had decided, somewhere along the way, that full attention was no longer worth the effort. His amber eyes were quiet and direct in a manner that reminded Cormac uncomfortably of men he had served with. Men who had seen enough that they stopped needing to perform calm. Men who simply were calm because the other option cost too much. Before we go further, tell us where you are watching from today, and if this story finds you somewhere you needed it, please subscribe for more. The drive to Kelowna from Cormac's property in the South Okanagan had taken just under an hour, through the dry hills going yellow-brown in the September heat. His daughter, Laurel, had driven because she had taken to driving him places the way she had taken to calling on Sunday evenings and leaving soup in containers on his porch step. Laurel was 31, dark-haired like her mother, with the same habit of tilting her head slightly when she was worried and pretending she was not. She had her mother's stubbornness, too, which was probably why she had kept asking about the dog. Cormac was 57 years old, a former naval officer, 2 decades in the Canadian Forces, much of that time with Kansifcom, the special operations branch that did not publicize its work and did not ask men to talk about it afterward. He had been a large man when he was younger, built for the work he had been trained to do, and he was still broad through the shoulders, though the last 2 years had taken something from him that showed in the way he moved. Slower, not from age, but from the particular fatigue of a man who had stopped seeing the point in hurrying. His wife, Margaret, not in the list that mattered here, but the one that mattered to him, had died 22 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, which did not ask permission and did not negotiate, and was over in 11 weeks from diagnosis. Cormac had been with her every day of those 11 weeks, and then he had been alone, in a house that was the right size for 2 and entirely the wrong size for 1. He had tried to do what was expected, kept the routines, cut the grass, answered messages when Laurel called, made coffee each morning and drank it standing at the kitchen window overlooking the orchard that Margaret had planted when they first moved to the property, 23 years ago. The apple trees still bore fruit. Cormac had not picked them the previous autumn. He had watched them fall. Poe was still pressing his muzzle against Cormac's knee. The shelter volunteer, a young woman named Devon, with a practical ponytail, and the patient energy of someone who had learned to let animals make their own introductions, watched from a few feet away. She had explained that Poe had been surrendered by an elderly man who had gone into care, that he had lived in one home his whole life, that he was gentle with strangers but rarely sought them out, and that he had been at the rescue center for nearly 4 months without anyone expressing serious interest. 4 months, Cormac thought, was a long time to wait for something that was not coming. Laurel was crouched near the far end of the hall, making friends with a young retriever mix who was nearly vibrating with the need to be loved immediately by anyone within reach. The retriever licked her chin. Laurel laughed, a real laugh unguarded, and for a moment she looked the way she had looked when she was 9 years old, and Margaret had surprised her with a puppy on her birthday. That puppy had lived to be 14. They had buried him in the corner of the orchard, where the old Spartan apple tree still leaned into the prevailing wind. Cormac looked back down at Poe. The dog looked back at him. There was nothing asking in Poe's expression. No performance, no appeal. He was simply there, a warm weight against Cormac's leg, making no demands and offering no promises. It was, Cormac realized with the slow surprise of a man who had not felt surprised in a long time, the most comfortable he had been standing in a room with another living creature since the hospice. He did not adopt Poe that afternoon. He told Devon he needed to think about it, thanked her for her time, and drove home himself because Laurel had offered to stay and fill out papers. He drove with both hands on the wheel, and the hills were the same dry yellow, and the light on the lake was the same flat silver. And everything was the same except that somewhere between the shelter parking lot and the turnoff for his road, Cormac Delaney understood that he was going back. He went back the next morning before he had coffee, which was the first time he had done anything before coffee in 2 years. Poe came home on a Tuesday. The house had not changed in preparation for his arrival. Cormac was not a man who bought things in advance on the strength of hope. He had an old blanket, a water bowl from the hardware store in town, and a bag of food Devin had written down for him on a notepad. Poe walked through the front door, moved carefully along the perimeter of the living room, with his nose close to the baseboards, investigated the kitchen, found the back step and sat there for a moment, looking out at the orchard, and then returned inside and lay down beside the wood stove as if he had lived there all his life and had simply been away for a while. Cormac stood in the kitchen doorway watching him. He had expected the house to feel more complicated, more presence, more noise, more accommodation required. But Poe was quiet in the way that only old animals and old soldiers are quiet, not emptily, but fully, as though whatever noise had once lived in him had been considered and set aside in favor of something steadier. Laurel came the following evening with groceries and the retriever energy of someone trying not to show how pleased they were. She set bags on the counter, asked twice if Cormac needed anything, and then sat on the floor and let Poe sniff her hand while she told him about the drive and the traffic on the connector and a story about a colleague at the school where she taught. Poe put his head in her lap. Laurel's voice went soft and she stopped talking about traffic. Later, after she had gone and the house had returned to its particular quiet, Cormac sat in the armchair by the window and watched Poe sleep. He thought about how long the dog had waited in that kennel. 4 months of strangers coming through and moving on to younger dogs, brighter dogs, dogs without gray muzzles and folded ears and the careful dignity of a life already mostly lived. He thought about what it meant to be passed over that many times, and still press your muzzle gently against the knee of the next stranger who came through the door. He did not know what that kind of faith looked like in a man. He was not sure he had it anymore. 3 weeks into Poe's residence, the dog found the door at the end of the hall. It was not a dramatic discovery. Poe did not scratch at it or whine. He simply lay down in front of it one evening while Cormac was in the kitchen, and when Cormac came down the hall and saw him there, the back of his throat went tight in a way he had not anticipated. The room behind that door had been Margaret's studio. She had painted, not professionally, not for anyone but herself. Landscapes mostly, the hills around the property in different seasons, the lake in different light. After she died, Cormac had closed the door and not opened it since. Her brushes were still in the glass jar on the windowsill. Her last canvas was still on the easel, half finished, a view of the orchard in early spring that she had begun in February of her diagnosis year and never completed. He had told Laurel it was storage. Laurel had not pressed him, which meant she understood, and which cost her something, because Laurel was a person who wanted to fix things and she was learning, slowly, that some doors could not be opened from the outside. Poe lay in front of the door with his chin on his paws. He was not guarding it. He was not demanding entry. He was only there, the way he was always somewhere near Cormac, not underfoot, not performing devotion, just present, available, like a man who has taken up his post and does not require explanation for it. Cormac sat down on the floor of the hallway, his back against the wall, knees up, the way he had sat in other tight spaces in other countries a long time ago. Poe shifted, turned his head, and looked at him with those amber eyes. "She'd have liked you," Cormac said. The words came out rougher than expected. He had not said Margaret's name aloud in the house since the last time Laurel had visited, and he had changed the subject then. Poe's tail moved once, slowly, against the floor. Cormac put his hand on the dog's gray back. He felt the warmth of him, the steady, shallow rise of his breathing, and he sat with it for a long time while the evening light moved down the wall, and the house made its quiet noises around them. He did not open the door that night, but when he stood to go to bed, he left the hallway light on. It was a small thing. He had no particular reason for it. He did it anyway. The first hard rain of October came in sideways from the west, the way Okanagan autumn always announced itself. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the season had been holding its breath and finally gave out. Cormac woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of it against the bedroom window and lay still for a moment in the dark, locating himself the way he always did, cataloging the sounds until they resolved into ordinary. Rain, wind. The old fir tree on the south side of the house moving against itself. Then a different sound, the back step screen door, swinging. He had latched it the previous evening. He was certain he was out of bed before the thought completed itself, his feet finding the floor with the automatic efficiency of a man whose body had not entirely forgotten its training. The hallway was dark. He moved through it and reached the kitchen in time to see the back door ajar, the latch hanging, the screen banging in the wind. Poe was gone. The word that left Cormac in the dark kitchen was not a command word and not a prayer, but it was close to both. He pulled on boots and his work coat and went out into the rain without a flashlight, because the yard was his yard and he knew every step of it in the dark. He had rebuilt the back fence in July. He had checked the gate last week. He called Poe's name into the rain and heard nothing back but water. He found where the fence had given. Old post at the northwest corner, softened by years of moisture, and the wind had done the rest. The gap was not large, but Poe was not a large dog. Cormac shone his phone light through the gap into the orchard beyond, and in the wet grass he could see the pressed-down shape of a trail leading away between the trees. He went through the gap. The orchard was dark under the low sky, the apple branches dripping, the ground soft and cold beneath his boots. He moved methodically the way he had been taught to move in terrain with limited visibility, slowly, listening between calls, letting his eyes adjust rather than forcing them. He had done this in worse conditions. He reminded himself of that and found it did not help as much as it used to. He was thinking about the dog in the rain, alone, old, possibly disoriented in the dark. He was thinking about how Poe had waited 4 months for someone to come back for him, and what it would mean if Cormac were the person who lost him in the first place. He called Laurel. She answered on the third ring, sleep in her voice, which sharpened immediately when she heard his. "I'll be there," she said before he finished explaining. She arrived 20 minutes later in her raincoat, her dark hair wet under the hood, a good flashlight in her hand. She had also called her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Glenis, who volunteered with the local search and rescue auxiliary and knew the land south of Cormac's property well. Glenis arrived in a sensible truck with rubber boots and the unflappable composure of a woman who had been woken by worse things and shown up anyway. The three of them spread out through the orchard. Cormac moved along the eastern edge, where the older trees grew close together and the canopy had kept some of the ground dry. He thought about the night Poe had come home, how the dog had sat on the back step looking out at these same trees. He thought about what draws an old animal out of a warm house into October rain. Not mischief, not youth, but something older. Instinct, perhaps, or the pull of something familiar in an unfamiliar life. He had reached the old Spartan tree, the one that leaned into the wind, the one that marked the place where Margaret's first dog had been buried, when he heard it. Not a bark, a low, soft sound, almost under the wind. Cormac stopped, crouched, swept the light along the base of the tree, and there was Poe, curled tight against the roots, his gray head up and his eyes reflecting the beamback amber and steady in the wet dark. He was not injured. He was shivering slightly, his coat dark with rain, but his tail made a single slow sweep when the light found him. He had come to the oldest tree in the orchard and lain down at its roots in the rain. Cormac knelt in the wet grass beside him. He was not a man who cried easily, and he was not crying then, precisely, but his face was wet in a way that was not entirely the rain, and he put both hands on Poe's damp sides and felt the dog's heartbeat, steady and calm, as though he had known someone was coming and had simply waited. "You absolute fool," Cormac said very quietly. "You absolute, perfect fool." Poe leaned his head against Cormac's chest and closed his eyes. Laurel found them a minute later. She stopped at the edge of the torchlight and looked at her father, kneeling in the rain with his hands on the old dog's back, and she did not say anything for a moment. She reached out and put her hand briefly on Cormac's shoulder, and then she turned and called to Glynis that she'd found them. And her voice was steady, because Laurel had learned steadiness from a woman who had not let an 11-week diagnosis be the whole of who she was, and she was not going to waste that inheritance. They walked back through the orchard together, Poe between them, unhurried. The door to Margaret's studio opened on a Saturday morning in November, 3 weeks after the rain. Cormac did not plan it. He was walking down the hall with a mug of coffee, and Poe was walking beside him, and when they passed the door, Cormac's hand found the handle without deciding to. It turned. The door swung inward. Stale air moved out, carrying the faint mineral smell of dried oil paint, and the cedar of the old blanket chest Margaret had kept her extra canvases in, and beneath all of that, very faint. The particular scent of her that he had stopped being able to name but still recognized without thinking. He stood in the doorway. Poe stood beside him. The room was exactly as it had been. The brushes in the glass jar, the paint-stained palette with its dried colors, the stack of finished canvases leaning against the far wall, and on the easel, the half-finished orchard painting. Early spring, the trees just beginning to show blossom, the light pale and new, the hills in the background still gray-brown but softening. She had painted it from the back step. He knew the exact spot she had stood. Cormac crossed the room and sat in the old wooden chair she had kept by the window. It was where she had sat to look at a painting in progress, head tilted, deciding what it needed next. He sat in it now and looked at the unfinished canvas and tried to understand what he felt, which turned out to be several things at once, stacked in layers the way the hills were stacked in her painting. Grief first, of course, always grief first, and then underneath it something that was not quite peace, but was in the same country. The orchard outside the studio window was bare now, November empty, but the old Spartan tree was visible from here, the one that leaned into the wind, the one where Poe had curled in the rain as though he had been keeping something safe. Poe walked to the middle of the room and lay down on the wood floor, chin on his paws, facing Cormac. He did not whine. He did not need to be coaxed out. He had done what he came to do, which was to be in the room with Cormac while Cormac was in the room with whatever lived in it. Cormac set his mug down on the windowsill. He thought about the last time he and Margaret had stood in this room together, the week before she went into palliative care, when she had looked at the unfinished painting and said she would get back to it. She had said it the way she said most things, not as a wish, but as a plan. She had been a woman who made plans and followed through on them, and the cancer had been the single thing in her adult life that had not consulted her schedule. He had not been able to say what he wanted to say that day. He was not built for it, which she knew, which was why she had not pushed. She had simply stood beside him and put her hand through his arm, and they had looked at the unfinished orchard together in silence, and he had understood later, too late, and then gradually less too late, that this was what she had given him instead of words, the willingness to stand in the unfinished thing and not demand it be resolved. He looked at the painting now. He looked at Poe. "I don't know how to finish it," he said aloud. He was not speaking to the dog, or not only to the dog. "I don't know if I'm supposed to." Poe's tail moved once, as though the question had been heard and acknowledged, and the answer was, that was not tonight's problem. Tonight's problem was only to be here. The rest could wait. Cormac picked up his mug and sat in Margaret's chair for a long time, while the November light moved across the studio floor and Poe breathed steadily at his feet. He cried, eventually, properly the kind of crying that is not performance and not release, but simply what happens when a container has been too full for too long and is finally held in a room that can absorb it. It was not graceful. He was a large man, and he was not a practiced griever, and none of it was quiet. Poe did not come to him or crowd him or try to make it stop. He only shifted once, moving closer, and rested the weight of his gray head against Cormac's boot. That weight. That small, warm, unhurried weight. It did not fix anything. It was not meant to. It was only company in the hard country, which was, Cormac would understand later, exactly enough. Laurel had been trying to get Cormac to the Remembrance Day ceremony in Penticton for 3 years. He had attended the ceremony at his base for 20 years, and since releasing he had found reasons not to go. Too far, too crowded, the wrong kind of gathering for the things he was trying not to carry in public. Laurel had stopped pushing the year Margaret got sick, and she had not resumed pushing since. But in the second week of November, Poe pulled a different thread. Laurel had called to say she was going to the ceremony with her partner, and she had mentioned, without pressure, that the local branch of the Royal Canadian Legion was doing a small fundraiser for the Kelowna Rescue Center, a pet visitation at the Veterans Lounge the evening before Remembrance Day. Rescue animals, the kind of low-key gathering that did not require speeches, or standing at attention, or being seen needing something. Cormac said he would think about it. Poe was sitting across the kitchen when he hung up the phone. The dog regarded him with the amber patience of a creature who had learned that impatience accomplished very little and dignity was worth preserving. "Don't," Cormac told him. Poe put his head on his paws. They went. The Legion Lounge in Penticton smelled of coffee and old wood, and the particular warmth of buildings that had been full of people for a long time. Folding chairs were set along the walls, tables with donation forms and rescue brochures. A small photo display of animals currently at the center. Several volunteers from the rescue had brought animals. 2 young dogs, an older tabby cat in a carrier, and 1 small terrier mix who had decided the entire room was her personal territory and was enforcing this belief vigorously from the end of a lead. Poe walked in at Cormac's left knee and did not appear troubled by the room. He moved steadily past the young dogs, past the cat carrier, past the terrier's indignant authority, and he was not aggressive and not performative. He was simply present, with the same economy of manner he brought to every space he entered. Men came over to greet Cormac. Some he knew, some he had served with briefly, some were strangers of the right generation who recognized something in how he stood without requiring an introduction. He shook hands, answered questions about Poe with a directness that surprised him, accepted coffee, and did not move toward the door. Poe, however, moved somewhere else. Slowly, with the careful deliberation of an old dog who had decided something, he crossed the room toward the far corner where a man sat alone in a wheelchair by the window. The man was elderly, Cormac estimated mid-80s, with a thin face and large hands and the particular stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere and is not certain he will be able to stay. He wore a Royal Canadian Navy cap, and the metal ribbons on his blazer were old enough that Cormac could not read all of them from across the room. His name, Cormac learned later, was Aubrey Marsh, 86 years old, Korean War era, a resident of the care facility 2 blocks from the Legion, and he came to the branch dinners on occasion, and he rarely spoke beyond what courtesy required, and according to the volunteer who whispered this to Cormac, he had lost his wife the previous spring and had not had a visitor at the care facility except for a niece who came on statutory holidays. Poe sat down beside Aubrey Marsh's wheelchair. He did not put his head in the man's lap or demand attention. He simply sat, steady and gray and warm, in the way a person sits when they have taken up a post and are not planning to leave it. After a long moment, Aubrey's large arthritic hand lowered from the armrest and rested on Poe's head. The room did not go silent. The conversation continued. The terrier continued her territorial briefings. The coffee urn burbled. But something shifted in the quality of the air near that corner window. Something quieter and more serious, the way the air changes near anything that matters. Aubrey's shoulders lowered. His head bent. His mouth moved slightly, as if he were saying something too private for a room to hear, and Poe sat beneath his hand and did not move. Cormac watched from across the room. He was not a man who ordinarily watched other men in moments like this. His training had taught him to secure his own position before anything else. But he stood still with his coffee going cold in his hand. And he watched Aubrey Marsh's hand on the gray dog's head, and he understood something that he had been approaching for months without quite arriving at. Pain did not go away because a man had been through enough to be stoic about it. Loss did not close its account because a person refused to file the forms, and sometimes the animal who pressed himself against the knee of a stranger in a shelter was not choosing the strongest person in the room, but the one who most needed to understand that choosing was still possible. He thought of Margaret standing at the easel. He thought of her hand through his arm in front of the unfinished painting. He thought of Poe in the rain at the roots of the old tree, waiting. Laurel appeared at his shoulder. She followed his gaze to the corner. She did not say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, Mum would have said he knew. Cormac looked at his daughter. She'd have said dogs always know, Laurel said. She'd have said Poe walked into that shelter and picked the most stubborn, locked-up man in the building because he had work to do. Cormac said nothing, which was not the same thing as disagreeing. Spring came to the South Okanagan the way it always does. Tentatively at first, then with complete conviction, as though the hills had taken a vote and decided collectively that the gray had gone on long enough. The orchard behind the house greened slowly through April, the apple trees putting out their first pale blossoms in early May, the old Spartan last of all, as it always was, as though it had learned over its long years that there was no particular hurry and the season would wait. Cormac noticed these things now in a way he had not the previous year, or the year before that. He noticed the exact morning the blossoms appeared on the Macintosh row. He noticed the particular slant of afternoon light that came through the studio window in late April and fell on the easel in a stripe of gold. He noticed the way Poe moved differently in the warm weather. More slowly, more contentedly. His gray muzzle turning upward when Cormac opened the back door and the orchard air came in. The studio door had stayed open since November. He had not touched the unfinished painting. He had thought about it many times. He had sat in Margaret's chair many times, with Poe on the floor and the light moving across the half-finished orchard, and each time he had left the canvas as it was. Not from inability, and not from unwillingness, but from something harder to name. A sense that the unfinished thing was, in its way, accurate, that to complete it would be to impose a resolution on something that was genuinely still in progress. He had said this to Laurel one Sunday in March, and she had looked at him for a moment with her head tilted and her eyes too bright, and said simply, "That sounds like something Mum would have understood." He thought she was right. Glynis came by in April with a cutting from her kitchen garden rosemary, because she was that kind of neighbor, and stayed for tea, and spent 20 minutes talking to Poe with the focused sincerity of a person who believed, correctly, that dogs deserved the effort. She had also, Cormac learned, gone to visit Aubrey Marsh twice since Remembrance Day, bringing shortbread from her own kitchen and no agenda beyond presents. The rescue center had arranged for a therapy animal volunteer to bring a dog to the care facility on the first Tuesday of each month. Aubrey, the volunteer told Devon, had started coming down to the common room for the visits. He had started speaking at the meals. Cormac did not take credit for this, because credit was not the point, but he noted it, the way he noted the blossoms and the light, as evidence that the world was doing something other than contracting. Poe turned 9 in the spring, by the rescue center's best estimate. Devon texted Cormac a picture of a dog biscuit shaped like a bone, because she was young and enthusiastic, and had not yet learned that not all men responded to this kind of thing. Or perhaps she had learned it and sent it anyway, which was her own kind of stubbornness. Cormac showed the picture to Poe with the low-grade solemnity of a man who was not entirely sure he was not becoming a person who showed dogs pictures of dog biscuits on phones, and then he drove to the bakery in Summerland and bought a dog-appropriate treat so large and ridiculous that Poe spent 5 minutes simply regarding it before committing. Laurel came for a long weekend in May, with her partner and a bottle of good Okanagan Red and the retriever energy turned down slightly, because the house was different now, and she had calibrated accordingly. She walked through the orchard with Cormac in the evening, the blossoms already going to leaf, and they stopped at the old Spartan tree, and she put her hand briefly on the bark the way she sometimes did. "He chose well," she said. Cormac looked at Poe, who had wandered a few paces off to investigate something in the long grass and turned back now to locate them with his amber eyes, satisfying himself, and returning to Cormac's side with the quiet assurance of a dog who knew exactly where he belonged. "He always does," Cormac said. He was not speaking only about the dog. He was speaking about all of it. The unasked-for morning at the shelter, the 4 months Poe had waited, the November door, the rain, the old tree, the Legion lounge, the unfinished painting with the pale spring light in it, the Sunday calls and the soup on the step, and every small proof that the people who loved him had not stopped. He was speaking about the strange, unearned grace of being found in a place you were not sure you deserved to be found in. On the porch that evening, with the valley below them, going gold and soft in the long May light, Poe lay across Cormac's feet and exhaled slowly. Cormac rested his hand on the dog's gray back and felt him breathe. He had spent 2 years learning how to be in an empty house. He was still learning, would probably always be learning, because that was the nature of the particular country grief was. Not a place you left, but a place you learned to live in, until you noticed one morning that you had also, quietly, learned to live alongside it. The orchard was full of light. The studio door was open. The old dog breathed and breathed and breathed. Cormac Delaney, who had crossed harder terrain than this, and who would find a way through the rest of it, let himself sit in the warmth and understand that being rescued did not always look like being pulled from the wreckage. Sometimes it looked like an old gray dog with a folded ear pressing his muzzle against your knee in a shelter hallway, refusing to choose anyone else, because the work between you was not finished yet. Because, in fact, it was only just beginning.